So welcome everybody. I am Erin Robinson. I'm a consultant that works with Sampling Nature's Research Coordination Network, and I'm really delighted to be here and to kick off this webinar series with all of you and with Sara Lafia, who's our first presenter, and I'll introduce Sara in just a minute. But I wanted to take a couple of minutes to introduce the Sampling Nature Research Coordination Network and give you a little bit of context for this this webinar series. And so to just give a little bit of motivation for the Sampling Nature RCN, we know that science today demands fair or findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable samples, and they're important. The lineage and the connection to samples is really important for reproducibility of research. They're really valuable parts of science, and they can provide connections between diverse and disparate research questions, and they can be reused if they're preserved in really interesting and I think unanticipated ways. And so that's really where the Sampling Nature Research Coordination kind of comes in with this idea that there are many existing communities out there, and these petals all represent existing communities. They have different standards and different metadata. And so the goal is to bring those different communities together to learn from each other and to have some consistency around the shared common parts of sample curation. And this figure comes from a paper by Neil Davies, who's on the call, and others on iSamples, if you're curious. And I'll put the link to the slides in the chat in just a second. So there are two parts of the Sampling Nature and iSamples community that really realize that vision of bringing it together. So we have a sister project, iSamples, that we won't talk about today. That's the cyber infrastructure, and some of you may know that project. And then the Sampling Nature Research Coordination Network is meant to advocate for sample curation, to develop policies, to get community input, and really to overcome some of the social barriers that are around dealing with and curating samples. So our goals are to develop this community. So you all here are helping us develop this community of practice around material samples and coming together around these common challenges and incentives and thinking about how we do that. We're developing common resources. We're formalizing the process for gathering requirements and raising awareness within the scientific community and the general public in the role that samples play. So we do that in a couple of different ways. We have a metadata standards working group that's discussing that. We have policy recommendations. We're developing training materials, and this webinar series counts towards that kind of training and development of a platform to share best practices. And then we also have a series of workshops, and we will have I'll talk more about that at the end, but we have our third workshop coming up in December. And all of this is really to incentivize collaboration. So I would encourage you all to connect in the chat, to connect with each other, to ask questions. And really, this is about building this network of people who work with samples. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker today, Sara Lafia. Sara is a research fellow in the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research, ICPSR, at the University of Michigan. And she was just telling me before we started the webinar that she's in the last week of this postdoc fellowship. I know Sara from her work with ESIP, the Earth Science Information Partners. She was a Raskin Fellow in 2018. And then she's also made significant contributions to the Discovery Cluster and the Semantic Technology Cluster there. And she gave a talk at AGU last year that was really, I think, interesting and highlights some of the benefits of the work that she's been doing. And she's going to elaborate on that more here today with this project. So with that, Sara, I will stop sharing. And hand it over to you.
Perfect. Okay. Thank you so much, Erin. And thank you all for the opportunity to, kick off your webinar series. I think this is, as Erin mentioned, this is the last week of my postdocs. It's a really great opportunity for me to, kind of recap some of the work that I've been involved in at Michigan over the past year and a half, 2 years. And also just reconnect with some of you. I know I see very familiar names and faces on the call, so it's really great to be here with you. So again, my name is Sara Lafia, and my research is focusing on a number of different areas, ranging from data curation to machine learning and the science of science. So I'm going to touch on those topics during this talk today. And I'm focusing specifically on a research paper that Erin asked me to share with you. So in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and put the DOIs for the paper, as well as the code that supports it, in case that's of interest to follow up with later on. But yeah, the talk today is entitled Subdivisions and Crossroads, and I'm going to discuss my work to identify communities and data citation networks and make some connections between this research and some of the ongoing efforts in the Sampling Nature Research Coordination Network. So I'm really excited to connect with the Sampling Nature RCN today because my research focuses on showing the impact of data curation decisions. And in my postdoc, I've been involved in a couple of different projects that I'll talk about today, which really focus on this idea of being able to measure the impact and value of curation and archiving decisions. And so I wanted just to mention a couple of aspects of the impact of data curation that are relevant to this talk. I'm putting a link to this. I like this Kansa and Kansa article that came out of this group talking about the data quality concerns and how the data creation process and like data quality concerns are really important in terms of shaping the potential reuse of data, and that connects really well to the work I'm going to talk about today. I'm curious about what the relationship is between data curation and long-term reuse, and really focusing on how we can build feedback loops between, say, data reusers in the future and data archives as well as curators. And to that end, I've been really focused on using things like data citations as a way of measuring those impacts, both from archiving and curation decisions on data reuse and scholarship. And so the talk today will be in two parts. In the first part, I'll describe some approaches I've used with machine learning and natural language processing to help discover data references. And then later on, I'll show how I visualized the network of citations that my colleagues and I have been building out to help understand the impact of research data on the formation of communities as well as on scholarship. So I think data archives and as well as other organizations like them are really important for facilitating open science. From my perspective, I'm focusing more on the discovery and reuse of social science data sets, but more generally, I think that these, they're great opportunities to understand the mediation process, both for data discovery and data sharing through the archives perspective. And I'm interested in better understanding how users actually engage with objects like digital data and physical samples throughout their research process. So from the project I'm going to talk about at ICPSR, data curation work is really well, it's well tracked and it's well documented. And so I make use of a lot of what we might think of as found data to better understand what types of coordination efforts as well as decisions go into preparing data that are deposited for long-term storage and sharing. And then on the other end of that, I'm also looking at how various research communities are making use of that data. So really, again, trying to connect that loop between reusers and archives. So in terms of the site of study, many of you are probably familiar with ICPSR. It's a large social science data archive that performs many different functions. It's made up of over 800 institutions around the world, so it has a very global reach, and it's been around for many decades. So it has a lot of interesting, I mean, in terms of long-term reuse, it's a great place to look at how data sets evolve over time. It's also multidisciplinary. While there's a strong emphasis on social and behavioral science data, that covers many different areas and research communities. And so it's pretty comprehensive in terms of the topics and the methods that are used with ICPSR survey data. The data are also available through, in terms of what's publicly available, there are more than 10,000 publicly available studies made up of more than 250,000 data files. A subset of these are restricted, but for the most part, in this talk, I'm going to be focusing more on what's publicly available and reused. And the resource in orange that I've highlighted here is this bibliography of data-related literature. It's a pretty unique resource in that it's manually curated by staff at ICPSR. So over the past 2 decades and more, humans at ICPSR have been building out this really, really comprehensive bibliography in which we have many different types of literature ranging from peer-reviewed journal articles, conference proceedings, book chapters, and dissertations, as well as other types of news articles or reports where ICPSR data are cited. So that's really the resource that I'm focusing on in today's talk. And the reason why this bibliography is so valuable is that it essentially links data to papers that use the data. And so there are a number of different relationships that we can pull out of the bibliography. So in this toy example, you can see on the left side a couple of nodes, which are series or studies. And here we can see which data have been used together from those series and studies. So on the top, we see the NSDUH series, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, has been used alongside the Teenage Attitudes and Practices Survey by the author Sherman on the lower right-hand side. So through these relationships, on the one hand, we can see, for example, this idea of data co-citation, which data sets tend to be analyzed together or at least referenced together in literature. And then on the right side, we can explore metadata of the publications that cite ICPSR data to understand, for example, in which journals these citations appear, what types of disciplines are using the data, and how those might be shifting across time. So, in summary, the bibliography and other resources like it help to tell a valuable story about how research data are used and who's using the data, as well as how they're making use of this publicly available data. I also wanted to point to this. It's a visualization that was published by the journal Nature a couple of years ago. And animations and visualizations like this are really interesting in terms of exploring different trends in citation. I think this one was really interesting because it shows the disciplinary diversity of papers in the journal Nature. And here, each paper is a node that's been published in the journal over the past 150 years. And these nodes are color-coded by their main topics. So you can see the vast majority of these are Earth and space science articles. And they're linked by an edge if they cite a third paper in common. And so, with this choice of design principles, you can see, for example, which papers are really important in terms of linking different communities to each other. So in the upper left side, for example, you can see a cluster of physics articles, and a few of these actually cite papers in common with Earth and space research. So you can see, for example, what types of relationships hold between these publications, as well as what papers play important roles in the citation network in terms of bringing these communities together. So this for me is one of the this type of visualization is really inspiring, and I would love to be able to do the same thing, not just with social science research data sets, but with research objects more generally. So that's the ambition behind this work. So to get there, one of the challenges that I faced with this project was this idea of informal data citation practices. And so to account for this, or just to illustrate this rather, I'm taking 2 pages here from this article. The article is called The Political Legacy of American Slavery. And just in these 2 pages, you can see the passages that are highlighted in green along with these yellow tags. And these are all places where the authors talk about the data that they used in the paper. A few times in this particular article, the data are what we would consider formally cited, where it's unambiguous which particular wave of a survey was used, or a digital object identifier is used, or there's some other indication of which data specifically the authors analyzed. But in many of these other places throughout the article where the authors talk about the data that they're using, it's pretty vague. So the challenge that I wanted to address was thinking about how I could use computational methods such as natural language processing to help overcome this, and also help to identify those places in articles where authors talk about using data without formally citing them. So, and beyond this, also just doing a bit more analysis to understand semantically what's happening in these data references. Can we actually disambiguate reuse, for example, from mentioning mentions of a particular resource? And at least at ICPSR, I think this is interesting to unpack the human experience of doing this work as well. The fact is that retrieving these data references involves a lot of labor and time. And so this diagram is something that the information specialists at ICPSR came up with. It's their set of heuristics to help identify data use in publications. And if a paper meets these criteria, they're able to add it to the bibliography, but they have to do all of these checks. And so what I wanted to do was look at what they were already, what processes were already in place to see where we could supplement some of those review steps or decisions, and use, again, computational methods to try to support this work. And so, at least in the case of ICPSR, because there's so much manual work involved in searching for data references, reading through articles, and then trying to make the determination about whether or not the article is making use of ICPSR data, the bibliography to date is a bit uneven in terms of which, the temporal coverage as well as the topics. At the top, you can see publications in that bibliography that are just grouped by decade. And there's a strong bias toward newer content that has less to do with the review process, but just it has more to do with what's possible to search for and what's been digitized. So that's one issue that we're looking to overcome here. I think we would find similar problems, in other domains as well. And then on the bottom, this is each of the gold bars is represents the study citation ratio. So data at ICPSR are organized into topical archives. And so here, each of those has been normalized. Some of the archives are very large and have many studies, whereas some are very small. But if we normalize them to account for the variety and size, we see that, demographics, the data archived under demographics have an outsized engagement compared to data, at the bottom of this figure about disability and teaching methods. And so it's unclear, whether this is an artifact of how the bibliography has been constructed and which sources have been checked, or if it really means that demographics data sets are really, far more popular. It's just unclear. And this, so what I wanted to do was just come up with a more systematic way to search for data across all of these topical archives so that we could try to balance some of this representation. So the first step that I took was to actually search for sentences or passages in articles that we had already collected or had already been added to the bibliography. And so, I came up with this, these are just regular expression patterns in this table in the rightmost column, where there are different levels of likelihood assigned to sentences that I pulled out. So I was searching in existing papers for the set of keywords, which I decided would be highly likely. And if a sentence contains one or more of these keywords, such as sample or samples or census or censuses, it's likely to refer to some social science data. A medium likelihood rule would be acronyms, which is a really popular way to refer to well-known studies such as the ANES. And then low likelihood, which would just be sequences of uppercased words. So using these different patterns, I was able to pull out about 5,000 training sentences, both from the bibliography as well as from this other corpus of open source scientific articles that's provided by Allen AI. It's called the STORC, and this is really great because they've also already, we know already that these articles are open access and they've been pre-processed, so they're really easy to work with. So by isolating these sentences that contain some dataset entity in them, I use this approach on the front end. On the left, you can see the software is called Prodigy, and it works well. It's a quick way to label data so that you can dynamically train a model. And so on the front end, on the left, this is what the interface looks like. And so there's some metadata for that sentence, which indicates the paper it came from and what type of pattern it matches. And then you can just specify where the dataset entity is in that sentence. So by doing this over and over again in batches, as you can see on the right, we can pull batches of labeled sentences out of the papers and then iteratively train a model so that we can build out something that has reliable metrics. And the metric that I was most interested in maximizing is recall, because ultimately this task is going to have humans in the loop. And so it's less important for the model to be precise with each prediction. And it's more important for the model to be able to retrieve all possible candidates so that they can be reviewed by information specialists at ICPSR. So with a fairly reliable trained model, I was able to then build out this data detection pipeline that has 3 main steps. So the first row focuses on retrieving potential references. The second row focuses on getting full text for those references and parsing them. And then the final step is applying the named entity recognition model to the passages in those papers to predict whether or not they reference ICPSR data. So let me just walk through those steps really quickly. The first step for retrieval focused more on searching systematically for everything available in ICPSR's catalog at once. And this is not particularly novel, but it was really valuable because up until this point, ICPSR hadn't been able to make much use of APIs to search for references. And so we came up with a way to look for, to search for ICPSR study names, study DOIs, and study numbers against this subscription service called Dimensions. And we have access to this through the University of Michigan Library, and it's pretty great because it has a really large full text index with millions. I think at the time we searched it, claimed to have over 8 million articles available. And this is relevant for samples as well as other types of materials, but oftentimes references to data sets or studies are found in places like footnotes or captions or tables and figures. And so by searching against a full text index, we were not just relying on the data set being mentioned in standard parts of the paper. We were able to search for some of these more obscure places where data sets tend to be mentioned. So by doing this, we were able to retrieve more than 6,000 publications that had 1 or more study names, which they look like this, you can see in the table, as well as study DOIs, which is a smaller share, but study DOIs haven't existed for nearly as long. And then study numbers, which are just another identifier for ICPSR studies that predate DOIs. So we were able to gather several thousand publications using this search approach, and then run those, run the full text that we were able to get back out through an approach there's an open source package called Grobid that is easy to use in terms of converting PDFs into structured text. And so we use that to get essentially get sentences back out that we could run through the NER model that we had trained. And so at the very bottom here, you can see some examples of sentences that were predicted to have data entities. And then the data set spans in gray, indicating which part of the sentence indicates data set. And so in this first sentence, this data set also contains like a parenthetical reference at the end with an author and a year. So that points to the reference list at the end of that article. So that's easy to follow up on. But later in the same article, references were made to the CCES with different years, as well as the ANES with years as well. So in those cases, these are more informal ways of talking about these data sets, which were still flagged. And so this is proving to be a pretty valuable approach for identifying both formal and informal data references. So by doing this, this is dynamic, this is still going on. But so far we've been able to use this process to add about 1,000 new papers to the bibliography. Granted, there are over 100,000 that have already been manually collected, but I think that going forward, this approach hopefully will help speed up some of this curation work. And just in terms of going back to those original charts that I presented, on the left side, we can see the temporal coverage is still really biased toward newer content. The blue portion of each bar is what was previously in the bibliography, and the orange represent new hits. And so many of the items that we retrieved were published more recently, but I think that if we applied the same pipeline to other databases that had older literature, we would probably be able to use the similar process to search for references in older material. On the right side, we can see these are the topical archives, just abbreviated, but the big winner here is the ICPSR General Archive. That's where the large orange portion of the bar is shown. And this is important because there are various funding and sponsorship models at ICPSR, and many of the items that end up in the General Archive are subject to different types of curation and are just have different funding structures, and so as a consequence, the bibliography hadn't really focused on finding references for those items up until recently, and so we've been able to add many more references for those items, which tend to be more interdisciplinary anyway. So right now, the bibliography has over 101,000 publications linked to more than 8,000 studies, but the mystery continues because more than 2,000 of the studies still don't have any publications associated with them, even though we've searched in at least one database more systematically for references. So that's an open question right now. We're not sure if this means that nobody's reused data from these studies yet, or if we just haven't been looking in the right places still, and if we need to explore alternative places where we might be able to find examples of reuse for those studies. So that's an interesting question. So the point of doing all of this more systematic search and expansion of the bibliography was so that we could build out a more reliable data citation network, linking publications to social science data sets that that had used them. And so after doing this systematic search, we were able to create this network. And so the small diagram on the left shows essentially a bipartite network with two types of nodes: publications, which are on the left in blue, and data sets on the red. And I, for this, was mostly interested in understanding from the archive's perspective what types of dataset co-citation were occurring. I fully recognize that exploring the other side of this network, for example, the papers that are the communities that are formed around specific studies, are equally interesting, but I'm just going to focus mainly on dataset co-citation for this part of the talk. So just by looking at that left side of the diagram to see which data sets have been used together, the dataset co-citation network looks like this. It's a bit difficult to see what's going on at this scale, but essentially here each dot is a node, which is an ICPSR dataset, and the nodes are linked by the publications that have used them in common. So in order for nodes to be linked, they have to be used together in 2 or more publications. And then here, they're also, each edge is assigned a weight based on the total number of times those items have been used together. So really heavy edge, really thick edge means that those items are really commonly used together. So if we zoom in on what these items are, by looking at the overall network structure, we can see a few interesting trends, which highlight those studies or series that have structural features that make them important in this dataset citation network. So the item in red, the National Health Interview Survey Series, has a very high degree in this dataset co-citation network, meaning that it's very connected. It has many inbound edges, so it's highly connected to many of the other studies or series in this network, meaning it's heavily used with many other items, which matches up with what's known anecdotally about this survey series, because it has things like crosswalk files or other descriptors that make it really valuable to combine with other data sets. The item shown in blue, the Census of Population and Housing, has high betweenness, which means that it's not nearly as connected. It's not used to the same degree that the other studies and series are, but structurally in the network, it helps to bring together or unify different parts of the network that would otherwise be disjoint. So it plays a really important role as a hub. And then those items that are purple have both high degree and high betweenness, meaning that they're highly linked to other items in the network and they're structurally important. And so just using this approach to identify these important hubs in this network was our first attempt to understand some of these usage trends from the bibliography. But what's more interesting, I think, is not just isolating those really integrative hubs, but rather understanding the communities that are formed around them. So my co-authors and I tried a number of different community detection methods to try to understand what the community structure of this network looked like. And the one that seemed to match what we were after the best is this method called K-click percolation, which has a pretty permissive, you can set the community size to be however you wish. So I was very interested in understanding even very small communities. So I set the minimum size to be 3. And this definition also allows for overlaps. So that is great because we can identify those studies or series that play, again, those integrative roles across these research communities. So using this approach, I was able to find 41 different research communities within the dataset co-citation network. So this is an overview of what the community structure looks like. And here it's a bit of it's a lot to take in visually, but there's also an interactive visualization for this in Tableau, which is hyperlinked here. I can put that in the chat later if you want to play around with it. But what I've gone ahead and done is each of the nodes here is a study or a series, which is grouped, and the communities are color coded and labeled according to the subject terms that they share in common. So just as an example, this inset box is pointing to a community with 3 studies that describe crime rate, citizen participation, and citizen patrols. And using this approach, it's actually pretty interesting because the communities themselves are fairly coherent topically, and they tend to they tend to be surprising in some cases, where the data come from, for example, investigators that are completely different, or funding sources that are very different, but users have identified these in common. And so really looking at use more from looking at these communities from the user's perspective is really what this enables. So just to illustrate this a bit more, I was thinking about what types of structures or labels to give these structures. And so to contrast these smaller communities that tend to be on the edge of town, so to speak, I really began to think about these smaller communities on the edge of this diagram as subdivisions. And so I've labeled a few of these just as an example. The one in pink I think is interesting. It's 4 different studies that deal with terrorism, terrorists, and radicalism. One of them I've labeled here, for example, and they tend to get used together. They are all topically compatible, but they may have very different variables. And so, just looking at these in more depth, thinking about what types of reuse scenarios would be relevant here. These types of data sets might be valuable for somebody who's looking for data sets that are like analytically compatible, that might be good for developing some specific kind of curriculum around. So things like instructional purposes or training might be a good starting point for pulling these communities of exclusive reuse out of the network. And then on the other side, I was thinking also about which studies fall into these overlapping zones between the communities. And it turned out that there were 20 studies or series that I thought of as Crossroads, because they help connect, again, parts of the network. And so, again, I've labeled, they're shown here in orange, and I've labeled a few of these in the network as well. And so, the one on the top is this patterns of behavior in police and citizen transactions. That study in particular has been used in very surprising ways. It helps, for example, to connect the community about terrorism research with other work that's more behavioral in nature, that deals with demographic characteristics. So again, just thinking about, we can describe these studies in terms of their metadata, but by bringing in their reuse and the types of research methods and topics that they've supported, we can begin to characterize them in very different ways. So I was thinking about what types of reuse scenarios would be supported by finding these types of data sets. And I was thinking, for example, about a graduate student or somebody else who's starting a research project. I think that, for example, figuring out which studies are highly interoperable and have broad utility might be a good starting point for writing a grant or starting a research project. So just again, trying to think about what types of scenarios each of these types of use might support. So just to sum up the contributions from this project, we've developed a named entity recognition model for the retrieval step, which supports ongoing human efforts to collect informal data references. And that's led, at least at ICPSR, to a larger corpus that's more comprehensive, that we can use to construct metrics about data reuse for archive data. And that's allowing us to do this network analysis of ICPSR data reuse communities that I just showed. And I want to make sure that I make some pretty concrete connections to the efforts of this group. So I was thinking about some connections or parallels between this project I just presented and work I've done with Andrea Thomer, who's on the call, with and other colleagues at the University of Michigan. And what was interesting is I had an opportunity to take some of the same workflow and model that I had developed for this project looking at the impact of social science data sets and see how, to what extent it would help us gather specimen citations for the University of Michigan's Museum of Zoology, Division of Mammals. And so I just wanted to touch on that briefly. We found similar, we experienced similar challenges to the other project. For one, the many references to specimens were not standardized, and so it was very difficult to surface, to reliably surface and disambiguate what types of references had been made. We had, again, a similar challenge, which was that a lot of references to specimens are, in undigitized literature or materials that are not easily searchable online. And in addition, a lot of references tend to be buried in supplementary materials. So depending on the publisher and the way you retrieve the actual publication, it's not intuitive to, it's not necessarily the easiest thing to search in places like appendices and supplements for specimen references. And so Andrea and her colleagues also have been leading this manual review process to help us understand what's happening, what we can and can't retrieve programmatically and why. And so that work is definitely ongoing. But the vision is that once we can overcome barriers like retrieving and reliably counting citations for specific specimens, we would like to be able to measure the specific research impacts of individual specimens or samples, and then also be able to show, like, visualize the reach of these collections. And so this table, or figure rather, is showing the total count of citations we've been able to retrieve for specific specimens so far. And I really believe that there are far more than this, but this is the vision, the long-term vision for this work. And so just thinking across both of the projects I've touched on, I had some thoughts for recommendations that hopefully can jumpstart more of a conversation with this group. I think this is nothing new, but really, what I've been seeing across both of these projects is that it's very important to promote citations for all sorts of research objects, whether they're material samples, specimens, research data, or data sets. And we've seen, at least, that, in the work that I've done, that it's essential to issue machine findable and persistent identifiers for research objects, and make sure that authors have proper guidance and incentives to give credit to the research objects that they use. And also, from an archives perspective, again, make sure that the archives and other distributors are able to work with publishers and funders to help enforce citation standards to make sure that we are able to retrieve citations for these objects. At the same time, I think I'm very interested in contributing to this area, but the curation of high quality bibliographies of citing literature is essential for being able to show impact. And so again, I think, with the advent of things like large language models or LLMs, like, the computational methods are really ready for us to take advantage across every step of the search process that I've described, from search and retrieval to prediction. I think that we are going to be able to do this, at scale really, really well. At the same time, I think there's it's increasingly evident that we need more things like manual curation, and we need human expertise to help describe what's found, so that that these bibliographies and reference lists are reliable and usable for end users. And then lastly, I think each of these projects is focused on a particular collection or organization, such as ICPSR. I'm really curious about what this work looks like when we're able to link across citation networks. So I'm excited about the work that is happening here, this RCN, to initiate more projects across organizations to help discover co-citations, at a much broader scale, and also think about how we can support each other in doing some of this work. So this is my contact information. Please feel free to contact me either directly right now or just email me later to get in touch. And I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you so much for the chance to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. This was really wonderful. So we do have time for questions. And I wonder, people just want to unmute themselves. We can just, or raise hands, that's all, any of that's good, but looks like Ted's got a question.
Thanks, Sarah. This is really really interesting. I wanted to make sure in the decision process about the connections between papers and data sets, you mentioned human curation or manual curation, and basically that was done for everything that you were finding using the models and NLP, right?
Right.
And were the people that were doing that were the same people that had been sort of making these connections in the bibliography sort of over time?
Exactly. Yeah, that they serve effectively as a bottleneck for the process, but the end result is that their objective is to collect things that demonstrate use. So if, for example, if a paper mentions a survey a few times but doesn't indicate that the authors reanalyze the data, so to speak, that item wouldn't be added to the bibliography. So they're really doing some of that work to make sure that the reference indicates data use rather than just a mention. That's kind of the core of it.
Yeah. I mean, this augmentation of human curation by automatic means is something that's really interesting. And I said I'm going to remember your words, functioning effectively as a bottleneck. An interesting thing. I also wanted to mention one other. I put a URL into the chat that you're probably well aware of, but there is a tool out there now called Connected Papers, and it's using some semantics and semantic analysis to try and connect papers rather than just DOIs and references and stuff. So you put in a DOI and it gives you, it is doing a full text analysis to find these related things. And it finds related things that, so it finds a group of papers that are related to the thing that you searched for, and then it finds things that those papers reference. So it takes the concepts that's represented by that subset and sort of passes it back through time. And then it also finds future papers that reference things in that group. So and the founder of this company and I had a talk a little while ago, and he's really very interested in this connection between data sets and papers. And so it could be an interesting resource that people like yourself and others that are interested in this might want to try and engage somehow.
Yeah, this was on my radar, but I hadn't made the connection to data sets. I would love to see how data sets factor into that, because I think, in some cases, I do wonder too if I know things like reputation of authors or just authors' individual social networks influence the data that they're aware of. So I think if we could add something like that into the social network, so to speak, of researchers, that would be pretty awesome. So I'll keep following to see what happens with that.
Thanks.
Sarah, I really appreciated the connection at the end to the samples. So I wonder if anybody on the call has reactions to that or questions or thoughts about how we might extend this work around specimens. Megan.
I have a half full question. Really would just be, Sarah, I'd love for you to have more eyes on what the ESIP physical samples cluster is doing, the guidance they're developing, and others, and just what would you recommend that they for sure include in their guidance on citing samples, and of course for others who are working on similar initiatives.
I think the last update I had on that was at the last AGU meeting. I think that many of us were at. I think it would be interesting to compare some of the I don't know, the maybe more obvious things that I just said at the end of the talk about, the need for identifiers and but also the kind of relationships that I think this RCN is building as well are really crucial. So yeah, I've also wondered that too, how to like which lessons from my experience, at a data archive dealing with very different types of materials, which are mostly social surveys, like would be relevant for other types of items like specimens or physical samples. So that's, yeah, very interested in hearing from this group about that as well. Thank you.
Well, on that note, I'm curious if you could say more about the differences between what you saw with the social science data sets versus the samples, and what are some challenges that might be unique to our area versus the well-oiled machine that is ICPSR.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think the maybe superficially, I was surprised by the lack of differences, at a certain level of granularity. Like the approach I took to building something like an identity recognition model was very similar. And I think that I think on the data set, like the retrieval part of this project, it was fairly similar. One obvious difference is that things like studies have, often have identifiers which are easier to search for, but I think the thing I was less clear on was at ICPSR they're very strict collection criteria, whereas I got the sense from the museums that we were partnering with that wasn't as much of a concern, making the distinction between use and mentions and that sort of thing. So I'm not sure actually if that's the case, but that seemed to be a bigger difference I noticed.
Yeah, there's a big difference in the bibliographies. So ICPSR, like I love that slide, and I might need to spend some more time looking at what Elizabeth has written about that, of like, what are the criteria for including evidence of use of a data set in a bibliography? Whereas I know a lot of the collections that are trying to maintain bibliographies are doing it, they just don't have the time. They don't have bibliographers. And so it's something that mentions it, something that they're aware of, anything that someone's authored. So maybe refining the criteria for building those bibliographies could be a good first step towards supporting collections and doing this sort of tracing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. I know that, like, yeah, in our case, or the case of UMMZ, they have many items they've collected, which are papers published by affiliates of the museum, but the connection between the author and the materials is not clear. So even having something more descriptive like that comes with that would be really great for people who are going to reuse or dive into that literature later on.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrea. And Megan for the mention of the cluster. Andrea put the link to the cluster in the chat. So Sarah, you mentioned email is the best way to get in touch with you if people want to follow up. And I wonder, is your University of Michigan email going to stay active?
I am told that it will. So
great. Super. Super. Well, I think in the interest of time and keeping us on track, if you have additional questions that you want to ask Sara, email is the best follow-up. And then I just wanted to share my screen one more time and share a couple of ways to stay involved and let you know about some things that are upcoming. So we're continuing to add to the Sampling Nature website. So that's the best place to find sort of generally the things that are going on. This series will have 2 more talks that are confirmed for the rest of this year. So it's an every other month series. So our next talk will be September 8th. Lindsay Powers is on the call and is the contact for that call. It'll be on USGS's collections management. And then November 3rd, we will have Sara Kanza and potentially others talking about the open context experience that they've had. She's currently in the field right now, digitizing metadata in the field. So we're excited to hear from her about those experiences. And then the other thing to just have on your radar is that we'll have our 3rd Sampling Nature workshop December 6th and 7th at New York University. And then finally, a call to submit abstracts to our session on enabling open and interoperable access to physical samples and their associated digital artifacts. We'd love to get a wide range of different disciplines represented at this session. So if you're interested, abstracts are due August 2nd. And I think that's all I've got. So thanks everybody for coming, and thank you so much, Sara, for your talk, and I think it was interesting for me to see the relationship between adjacent kinds of research objects and the similarities that they have, and what we can learn from what you did with data for samples, because there's clearly, as you articulated, so much overlap. So thanks everybody.
Thank you so much, Erin. Great to see everybody. Thanks for the chance to connect with you. This is great.
Thanks again, Sara.
Thank you.
Stop recording.